So let's talk about oranges.
Okay. To give the background about what happened in Monrovia, we need to talk first about what happened in Duarte. Duarte began to be settled in 1873, and the first things they grew were deciduous fruits. But after a couple of years, they realized that oranges were a definite possibility. So I think the first grove might have been set out 1874, 1875 on Eugene, I believe, property owned by a Eugene Meyer. Anyway, they soon realized that the soil, the alluvial soil, the abundant water, and the elevation, which made the area almost frost-free, were the conditions that were great for oranges. So they started growing oranges. So by the time Monrovia was established in 1886, there was already a precedent for growing citrus. There are early pictures showing, like the 1887 panorama of Monrovia shows young orange trees being set out, had already set out and growing. By young, I'd say maybe 2-3 years old. You can tell they're all uniformly about the same height and they're very regularly spaced. So obviously a grove was purposely planted.
1886?
Well, the panorama is 1887.
And
December
so
of
who would have
1887.
done that? Because the...
Well, either C.O. Monroe or W.N. Monroe. I'm thinking maybe C.O. Monroe. So I believe that might have been about the beginning, was that grove. But by the time, let's say by 1900, almost all the area north of Foothill Boulevard up into the foothills was covered with citrus. There are postcards and other early pictures showing just a sea of orange trees. And again, the elevation was right, the alluvial soil was ideal for citrus, and there was water, abundant water available from Monrovia Canyon. In fact, the city of Monrovia used to have 2 water rates. This persisted until maybe the 50s or 60s, well, probably 40s or 50s. If it was water for domestic use, that was one rate, and it was for irrigating orange groves, it was for another rate.
Which would be lower?
Lower, yeah. So the groves, as I say, primarily north of Foothill, and there were some groves south of Huntington Drive. The center section of Monrovia, not so much orange groves, more houses on town-sized lots. Whereas the parcels north of Foothill were larger, and some of the parcels south of Huntington Drive were larger also, that would lend themselves to citrus growing.
So meaning 5 acres, 10 acres?
10 acres, right, in that range. Primary groves, I mentioned the C.O. Monroe Grove. There were oranges around, or the Studebaker House. There are early pictures of the Studebaker House taken looking south, probably from an elevation of 100 feet or so, and you can see the grove that had been set out there.
Where is that?
That would have been the northwest corner of Alta Vista and Banana, or Hillcrest. Others, James Fisher, I don't know if James Fisher planted them or if his predecessor, the Harveys, J. Fred and Clara, I don't know if they planted them. Anyway, he had extensive groves the west side of Grand Avenue, starting about where Aspen is now and heading north to where Kirkwood Place is. For Kirkwood was the location of the reservoir that watered all the groves below that. And he planted several different varieties, so they would come into bearing at different times during the year, so he'd have pretty good cash flow from his oranges. Those groves lasted until probably the 1960s or 70s, when the last of the orange trees were pulled out. But I can remember as a youngster, the area, at least the area north of Greystone, was covered in orange trees, and further south as well. In fact, as you drove into his home place, before Aspen was put in as a street, there was a post with two signs on it. It said Sun-Kissed Grower, James Fisher and Jane Jackson. Jane was his daughter, and she continued the tradition of orange growing after her father died. So that was typical. If Sun-Kissed was a cooperative, and so if you marketed your oranges through Sun-Kissed, apparently they provided you with a sign testifying to the fact that yes, you were a Sun-Kissed grower.
Who were other growers?
Senator Herbert Evans.
State senator?
Yes, state senator in the early days. His house still exists at 234 North Canyon, and the grove was around that. East of it, the house is on the east side, and I'm assuming it may have been as far east as that circular part of Poinsettia, because that was all groves. And then George Spence, son of J.P. Spence and nephew of E.F. Spence Sr., had a large grove in the southeast corner of Canyon and Greystone, probably about 10 acres. Captain Alfred Stedman had an orange grove, probably Primrose, south of Hillcrest. And he and C.O. Monroe were in partnership and had the Monrovia Heights Citrus Association. And I mentioned their packing house was down at the Santa Fe Railroad.
So he is the man that Stedman, the street.
Stedman Place.
Stedman Place. So is named after.
Named
So
after.
is that where his grove was?
Very roughly. So the area north of Foothill was primarily citrus until the 1920s, when Monrovia, again, the post-World War I boom, Monrovia was growing, home sites were needed, and so many of the owners of orange groves had them subdivided. Margaret Jaycox, for example, had a large orange grove that ran from Hillcrest north, and she decided to subdivide and put in lots instead of growing orange trees. She didn't want to tear down the house that she was living in, which was originally Milton and Mary Monroe's wedding present. So she simply had it picked up and moved and put in a more convenient location to accommodate the subdivision, and extended Melrose Avenue north. I think of some of the others. C.O. Monroe subdivided the most of his orange grove about 1906 or 7. Some of the others, the Monroe edition was large lots. So even though there might have been 3 or 4 owned by the same individual who was using them for agricultural purposes, they were basically town lots. And so the orange trees came out and houses were built on those properties. So by the 1940s and 50s, there might have been a sporadic orange grove here or there, but in terms of the vistas, endless vistas of orange trees that existed earlier, they passed out of existence. And oranges were no longer Monrovia's major cash crop. An era came to an end.